The air above Black Creek Mine held a perpetual haze, a fine talcum-like dust comprised of pulverized slate and residual iron, eternally suspended by the slight grinding winds that funneled down the dry canyons. 11-year-old Elias knew this dust intimately. It coated the inside of his nostrils, grit his teeth, and darkened the pale denim of his worn trousers until they looked like the rock itself. It was late afternoon, the sun sinking toward the jagged teeth of the western ridge, painting the sky in violent hues of rust and bruised violet. But the color never seemed to penetrate the oppressive monochrome of the mine site. Elias was moving slowly, tracing the perimeter of the fenced-off zone, a habit born of bored routine and a persistent, low-level worry. The main shaft had collapsed 3 days ago, not with a sudden, roaring boom, but a heavy, drawn-out groan, like the earth clearing its throat before succumbing to a fatal congestion. Now the site was defined by a vast, silent mound of rubble, concrete shattered into sharp facets, twisted rebar forming grotesque sculptures, and tons of dense grey earth piled high where the solid ground used to be. The rescue teams had packed up the heavy machinery hours ago, citing instability and calling the search officially suspended. It was this silence, deep and unnatural, that Elias had come to witness again. It tasted of finality. He was standing near the edge of the official collapse zone, a stretch marked by faded yellow caution tape that flapped weakly in the infrequent gusts. The ground here was uneven, the dirt soft beneath his worn canvas shoes, giving way slightly with each tentative step. He focused on the immediate physical world, the slight burn in his calf muscles from walking the uneven terrain, the persistent low-frequency ringing in his ears that the mine dust always seemed to exacerbate. Then the world tilted. It wasn't a seismic shift, but an auditory one, a sound so small, so utterly out of place against the backdrop of massive, crushing silence that Elias initially catalogued it as a misfiring of his own inner acoustics. He paused, rigid, every muscle fiber tightening. He held his breath until the air burned in his chest, forcing himself into complete stillness, trying to separate the noise of his own blood pumping from the external world. He heard it again. It was a sound of profound distress, high-pitched and choked, a whimper, thin and fragile, swallowed almost instantly by the density of the air and the absorbent quality of the pulverized rock. It was not the cry of an animal. It was too uneven, too sharp, with raw human pain. It sounded broken, like a sound made through gritted teeth and a blocked airway, amplified only by the unnatural quiet surrounding the debris field. A chill, far colder than the cooling air, crawled up Elias's spine. His eyes widened, fixing on the massive pile of jagged, fractured rock and compacted soil that marked the grave of the Black Creek shaft. The sound seemed to originate from within the pile, or perhaps just at its base, where the rubble had stabilized into a precarious slope. He took a single, agonizingly slow step forward, pushing past the fraying caution tape. The soil crunched loudly beneath his sneaker, and he winced at the noise, feeling an irrational fear that the sound of his own movement might somehow smother the fragile signal he was trying to track. He waited, counting the ragged beats of his own heart. There, a repetition. A brief, almost inaudible sound, followed by what sounded like the desperate intake of breath, wet and labored. It was undeniably a cry, a muffled protest against unimaginable compression. Elias began to move, with a focus he rarely possessed, his eyes scanning the base of the massive debris field. The slope here was steep, the risk of secondary collapse palpable. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to run back toward the dusty road and the distant failed promises of the rescue crews. But the sound, that fragile, vulnerable sound, tethered him to the spot. He edged closer, using a large, embedded piece of cracked cement as a pivot point, The air grew thicker here, smelling strongly of freshly disturbed earth and something metallic, something vaguely sweet and sickly, perhaps circulating hydraulic fluid or the faint scent of copper. He searched the immediate vicinity of the sound, which he judged to be about 10 feet directly ahead, where a massive, uneven sheet of rock lay canted against a smaller mound of soil, creating a small, triangular void. And then he saw it, wedged tight in the narrow gap formed by the leaning rock and the ground, barely visible beneath a curtain of fine grey dust and fragmented slate chips, was an object that did not belong to the geology of the mine. It was a backpack. It was a heavy-duty rucksack, a robust field model, military green, stained dark with moisture and compressed grit. One of the shoulder straps was strained taut, pulled violently at an unnatural angle, disappearing beneath the solid edge of the leaning rock, suggesting the owner might be anchored by the bag, or that the bag had been yanked free in the chaos. Elias dropped to his knees, heedless of the sharp stone fragments pressing into the bone. He reached out a trembling hand and grabbed the slick, grimy nylon fabric of the bag. It was surprisingly heavy, dense, and rigid. He pulled. It resisted. He braced his feet against a protrusion of rebar and tugged again, using all the meager strength of his 11-year-old frame. The fabric shrieked slightly against the abrasive rock. Slowly, agonizingly, the bag gave way, sliding out from its confinement. The strap that had been trapped snapped back violently, whipping a spray of dust into Elias's face. He drew the bag back, dragging it onto a slightly flatter section of ground. The whimpering had ceased entirely the moment he pulled the bag free, replaced by a profound, agonizing silence that felt louder than any sound. Had the slight shift caused further collapse? Had he broken the last tether to hope? Elias knelt beside the bag, his chest heaving, the metallic taste of panic coating his tongue. He had to know if the bag held a clue, an identity, something that could explain the source of the terrible crying. The exterior of the bag was battered, scuffed, torn in one small area, and heavily saturated with the damp, mineral-rich earth. The zipper's heavy-duty coiled teeth were jammed tight with grit. He worked the main zipper pull, scraping the mud away with his thumbnail, slowly, meticulously. The sound of the zipper grinding open was shockingly loud in the silence. The contents were not the haphazard collection of junk a hiker might carry. They were organized, deliberate, and spoke immediately of labor and necessity. The first item on top, wrapped in a thick, clear plastic baggie, was a hard-shell medical kit, standardized issue for industrial sites. He didn't dare open it completely, but he saw the glint of sterile aluminum foil wrapping compressed gauze pads and the pale green of a small tourniquet. He pushed it gently to one side. Beneath the medical kit was a dense roll of specialized nylon cording, designed for heavy lifting and resistant to abrasion. It was coiled neatly, demonstrating a user who valued order and preparation. Elias recognized it. His father, before he moved away to seek work in the city, had used similar cording on construction sites. He reached deeper, his fingers brushing against something soft and yielding, wrapped in what felt like a canvas tarp. He pulled the item free. It was a change of clothes, a thermal undershirt, thick wool socks, and a heavy flannel shirt, all meticulously folded. They were clean, smelling faintly of institutional detergent, yet bearing the heavy, masculine scent of use, of sweat and honest effort, dried and then folded away for the next shift. Elias lifted the heavy, damp mass of the clothing. Beneath it lay the true heart of the bag's identity, laid bare by the sudden withdrawal of the protective fabric. The first was a small, well-worn, leather-bound notebook. It was sealed shut by the dampness and the grit that had infiltrated the edges of the pages. He handled it with reverence, recognizing the type of record-keeping miners and contractors used. Shift times, equipment checks, perhaps personal notes. It was too dense to open without tearing the pages, so he carefully placed it beside the backpack. Next to the notebook, tucked into a side sleeve designed specifically for it, was a heavy, industrial-grade flashlight. Its metal casing was scratched and dinged, a testament to months, maybe years, of reliable use. It felt cold and solid in his hand. He pressed the thick rubber switch. Nothing. The battery was either dead or the connection broken by the impact. He laid it down beside the notebook. Elias reached back into the depth of the main compartment, his fingers scraping against the thick lining. He found a small, insulated thermos, heavy with liquid still inside. He recognized the shape and weight of a full thermos. It was the color of deep blue enamel. He lifted the lid, twisting slowly until the seal cracked. A faint plume of steam, bearing the rich, strong aroma of stale black coffee, escaped into the cool air. The coffee was still warm. The implication struck him like a physical blow. The owner had been using this bag recently, perhaps just moments before the collapse, carrying his vital supplies. The weight of the warm thermos, the scent of the coffee, anchored the reality of the crisis. This wasn't just equipment, it was a life interrupted. He placed the thermos down, his gaze momentarily fixed on the triangular void where he had found the bag. He desperately searched the remaining contents, hoping for an ID, a name, anything to connect this tangible collection of belongings to the muffled, agonizing sound he had heard. In the final, smallest compartment, nested deep within the lining, Elias's fingers brushed against something thin, delicate, and entirely incongruous with the heavy-duty gear surrounding it. He carefully extracted the item. It was a small, folded piece of paper, protected by a thin layer of plastic wrap that had somehow managed to remain sealed despite the trauma. He unfolded it slowly, the plastic crinkling faintly. It was a drawing, rendered in brightly colored crayon on slightly yellowed construction paper. The image was simple, earnest, and deeply resonant. It depicted a stick figure, rendered with exaggeratedly broad shoulders and wearing a bright yellow hard hat. The figure stood next to a much smaller, smiling stick figure, a child. Across the top, written in a child's uncertain script, were two words, "My hero." A small, painful lump formed instantly in Elias's throat. This was the definitive proof. This bag belonged to a person, a father, who carried the love of his child into the deadly darkness of the mine. He looked up toward the narrow gap in the debris. The air was absolutely silent now. The realization that the owner of the bag, the subject of the drawing, might be trapped just feet away, overwhelmed him. The vulnerability of the drawing, that tiny, fragile piece of colored paper, amplified the brutal reality of the collapsed earth. The memory of the cry, that wet, desperate sound, returned, piercing the silence with renewed intensity, magnified by the emotional context of the drawing. Elias gently refolded the drawing and tucked it safely into the pocket of his own dusty trousers. He had to go, to summon aid. But leaving this location felt impossible. He was the only witness. He reached again into the debris void, sliding his hand carefully along the slick, dark nylon of the remaining broken strap, following the path it had taken beneath the rock. His fingers scraped against rough stone, against cold, compressed dirt. He extended his arm until his shoulder pressed against the ground, his vision tunneling into the dark aperture. He couldn't reach the end of the strap. It was securely pinned, anchored by tons of rock, but his fingers brushed against something else, something warm, pulsating slightly against the cold granite. He froze, his hand suspended in the dark void. It was not rock. It was soft, yielding, a soft, almost imperceptible shift of the material, and then a faint, rhythmic pressure against his fingertips. A breath. Elias gasped, the air rushing back into his lungs, disrupting the oppressive silence. He pulled his hand back quickly, adrenaline spiking, his entire body shaking with the shock of tangible contact. Someone was alive. They were pinned, potentially injured, anchored by the backpack strap he had found. But they were breathing, existing just beneath the surface of the rubble, mere inches from his grasp. And then the sound returned. Not a loud cry, but a weak, guttural cough, followed by a low, drawn-out groan of pain that confirmed the voice he had heard earlier. It was muffled, heavy, sounding less like fear and more like sheer, grinding exhaustion. Elias scrambled back from the void, dragging the heavy green backpack with him. The realization of the gravity of the situation hit him with crushing force. He could not lift the rock. He could not crawl into that gap. He could not perform the rescue. He was a boy, 11 years old, facing a geological disaster. He stood up, his legs unsteady, knees locked against the trembling. He looked toward the distant ridge, where the last vestiges of daylight were fading into deep indigo. The nearest sign of civilization, the small, dilapidated general store on the main county road, was nearly 2 miles away, down a steep, winding path carved through the shale. He didn't need to consider the danger of the journey. The urgency of the breathing man in the rubble extinguished all caution. Elias grabbed the straps of the heavy green backpack. It was dense and awkward, a physical burden now symbolizing the responsibility he carried. He swung it clumsily onto his shoulders, the weight settling heavily across his shoulder blades, forcing him to lean forward slightly to compensate. He took one last, desperate look at the triangular void, listening for any final sound. "I'm going," he whispered, his voice thin and raw. "I'll bring help. Hold on." He didn't wait for a response he knew might never come. He turned and began to move, not running wildly, but maintaining a swift, desperate pace along the precarious, dusty edge of the mine site. The weight of the bag, heavy with the miner's tools and the warm thermos, was immense. It was the weight of expectation, of a life depending on his ability to cross 2 miles of treacherous terrain before the last light failed. The path from the mine was not engineered for speed. It was a winding, steep decline, littered with loose shale and sharp stones. Elias had to focus completely on his footing, the slightest slip threatening to send him tumbling down the slope, perhaps breaking a bone or worse, damaging the crucial evidence he carried. He adjusted the heavy straps, feeling the rough nylon chafing the skin on his neck. The physical effort required to move at pace with such a load quickly taxed his young frame. His lungs began to burn, sucking in the dust-laden air, which felt abrasive and insufficient. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, left foot placement, shifting weight, right foot placement, pushing off. The sound of his sneakers scuffing against the gravel was the only noise in the darkening world. Every few minutes, a spasm of panic would force him to accelerate, a terrifying image of the earth shifting, of the triangular void collapsing further, flashing behind his eyes. He imagined the trapped man, the owner of the warm coffee and the hero drawing, suffocating, his final breath extinguished while Elias was still struggling through the desolate landscape. He fought the urge to stop, to rest his aching legs. The straps dug deeply into his shoulders, creating grooves of sharp, localized pain. He tried to think of anything but the pain, concentrating instead on the physical presence of the bag. Inside it, protected by the heavy canvas, was the drawing. That small, bright depiction of love became his focus, his talisman against despair. He was running for that drawing. He was running for the man who carried it. The light continued to fail rapidly. The indigo sky deepened to a heavy, velvety black, punctured only by the first sharp pinpricks of distant stars. The path, difficult enough in daylight, now became a series of unseen hazards. Elias remembered the flashlight he had found in the bag. He could have used it, even if the battery was dead, perhaps to signal or simply to grasp as a comfort. But he hadn't wanted to break his stride to retrieve it from the main compartment. He needed the economy of motion, the singular purpose of moving forward. He stumbled heavily over a protruding root, the impact jarring his teeth. He fell forward, catching himself with his hands, the coarse gravel scraping his palms. The backpack pitched heavily over his head, its weight nearly flipping him onto his back. He gritted his teeth, suppressing a cry of pain, and instantly fought to regain his footing. He did not let go of the straps. The backpack did not touch the ground. The fall had stolen precious seconds and spiked his heart rate into a painful, frantic rhythm. He tasted blood where he had bitten the inside of his cheek. He pushed on, abandoning the path in favor of the easier, if more dangerous, slope of the canyon wall, hoping to cut off a long loop in the trail. The earth here was slicker, less stable. He had to spread his weight, moving in a low, controlled slide rather than a run. The sounds of the night began to awaken, the high, brittle whine of nocturnal insects, the faint hoot of an owl from the distant timberline. But beneath all those natural sounds, Elias heard only one thing, the faint, phantom sound of that distressed, wet cough demanding urgency. He finally reached the end of the steepest decline, his legs trembling uncontrollably, the lactic acid burning savagely in his muscles. Below him, he could see the faint, welcoming glow of the distant county road, the scattered yellow lights of the general store, and the single sodium vapor lamp hanging above the deserted gas pump. He was moving onto the final stretch, a gravel road that led straight to the small cluster of buildings that constituted the nearest outpost of human interaction. Here, the ground was more stable, allowing him to transition from a scramble back into a desperate, loping run, his chest aching with every inhalation. The weight of the backpack now felt like a crushing anchor. He considered dumping it, running free and fast, but the contents were the proof, the identification, the context, the very reason the rescue teams must return. He gripped the straps harder, refusing to release the burden. He ran the final few hundred yards, his vision blurring slightly from exhaustion and the fine grit that continually infiltrated his eyes. He burst into the small, lit clearing of the general store, the screen door of the establishment still open, casting a rectangular pool of yellow light onto the gravel lot. He skidded to a stop, his body weaving, nearly collapsing under the sudden cessation of movement. Mr. Harlan, the owner, a man known for his perpetual slowness and quiet demeanor, was standing behind the counter, wiping down the already clean surface with a rag. He was the only person in the store. Elias stumbled toward the door, collapsing heavily onto the wooden porch steps, dropping the green backpack with a dull, heavy thud that echoed in the quiet evening air. He tried to speak. The words were trapped, strangled by the dust and the constriction in his throat. He coughed violently, bending double, fighting for air. Mr. Harlan, hearing the commotion, looked up, his movements slow and deliberate, before his eyes finally registered the figure of the young distraught boy on his doorstep. "Elias, what in the good Lord's name happened to you?" Mr. Harlan's voice was low, tinged with genuine alarm. He immediately noticed the condition of the boy, covered head to toe in grey dust, trembling violently, gasping for breath, and carrying a mining field pack that was clearly not his. Elias finally managed to force out the words, fragmented and choked with residual emotion. "Mine collapsed again. Not far. Someone under the rock. I heard them. Crying. Groaning." He struggled to point back toward the ridge, his arms shaking uncontrollably. "They're pinned! They're alive! I felt them, right there, near the big wedge. They were breathing." Mr. Harlan moved quickly for the first time Elias had ever witnessed. He recognized the tone of absolute desperate urgency, a pitch of terror that no child could fabricate. "Breathing? You felt them, Elias?" "Yes, and I found this," Elias managed, reaching blindly for the heavy green backpack and dragging it toward the light. "It's his. He's trapped. The strap, it was anchored under the rock." Mr. Harlan knelt beside Elias, his thick fingers immediately running over the dense, dirt-caked material of the rucksack, assessing its weight and condition. He saw the industrial quality, the grime, the undeniable evidence of recent use at the site. "Who, Elias? Do you know who it is?" Elias plunged a shaking hand into his own pocket and pulled out the small plastic-wrapped drawing. The crayon colors seemed impossibly bright under the yellow light. He presented it to Mr. Harlan. "He carried this. He's a father. He's alive, sir. You have to call them. You have to tell them the location, the wedge rock, right where the old ventilation pipe broke off." Mr. Harlan took the drawing, his expression hardening into one of grave determination as he registered the profound emotional weight of the image. The silence was broken only by the ragged sound of Elias's desperate breathing. Mr. Harlan stood up swiftly, heading toward the counter where a bulky, corded landline phone sat. "Don't move, Elias," he instructed, his voice now sharp with authority. "Don't touch anything else in that bag. We need that evidence intact. I'm calling Sheriff Dawson and the Regional Emergency Response Coordinator. I'm telling them the search is back on right now." Elias slumped back against the steps, closing his eyes. The immediate pressure of the delivery lifted, replaced by the agonizing anticipation of the response. He listened to Mr. Harlan's voice, clear and concise, relaying the exact location of the discovery, the presence of the backpack, and the terrifying, crucial detail. The boy felt a human pulse and heard breath. Mr. Harlan returned minutes later, hanging up the receiver with a decisive click. "They're mobilizing, Elias. Dawson is 7 minutes out. The regional heavy rescue team is 20. They need to verify your account immediately. You have to tell me exactly what you found and where you found it." The interrogation that followed was relentless, though rooted in necessity. Elias, still shaking, recounted every detail. The sound, the silence, the trapped strap, the cold flashlight, the warm coffee, and finally, the drawing. Mr. Harlan meticulously documented the contents of the bag on a piece of ledger paper, treating the thermos and the clothes as sacred evidence. The tension in the small store was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. Elias felt a profound, draining vulnerability. He had pushed himself beyond his physical limits, and now he was forced to relive the terror, relaying the absolute fragility of the life he had located. Within minutes, the silence of the night was shattered by the approaching siren of Sheriff Dawson's cruiser, a rising, mournful howl that signified the immediate confirmation of the alarm. The cruiser skidded to a stop outside the store, lights flashing red and blue against the dark glass. Sheriff Dawson, a tall, imposing man with a weather-beaten face, stepped out, his expression grim. He moved directly to Elias, bypassing Mr. Harlan's hurried greeting. "Elias," the sheriff said, his voice deep and urgent, "is this true? You found someone?" Elias nodded, unable to speak, pointing again to the green backpack sitting on the steps. "The strap was anchored under the biggest piece of wedge rock, Sheriff, near the broken ventilation pipe. He's alive. I heard him cough. I felt him breathing." The sheriff knelt, examining the bag, his trained eyes immediately assessing the trauma to the nylon. Mr. Harlan quickly handed him the ledger paper and the small, brightly colored drawing. Sheriff Dawson studied the drawing for a long moment, the vibrant yellow hard hat reflecting in the swirling emergency lights. He pocketed the drawing carefully. "Harlan, keep the boy here. Do not let him go back up that hill. Elias, you did a brave thing, son. Now you stay safe." The sheriff didn't wait. He was back in his cruiser, lights flashing, accelerating rapidly up the dirt track toward Black Creek Mine, the engine roaring against the silence of the canyon. The first wave of rescue was initiated, based solely on the account of an exhausted, dust-caked boy and the weight of a full backpack. Elias sat on the steps, the immediate pressure replaced by a crushing wave of fatigue. Mr. Harlan brought him a thick, scratchy wool blanket and a glass of cool water, which Elias drank greedily, the liquid soothing the raw irritation in his throat. They waited. The minutes stretched into hours, defined by the distant echoing sound of heavy machinery mobilizing in the canyons. The thrumming of a massive diesel engine, the grinding whine of winches, the sharp, authoritative shouts carried faintly on the wind, sounds of life fighting death. Elias could not rest. His mind replayed the scene, the grey dust, the silence, the faint, desperate wheezing sound. He was tied to that spot in the rubble by the single contact he had made. Then a sound, different from the grinding or the shouting. It was a clear, strong sound, magnified by the night air, the sharp, sustained blast of an air horn, the agreed-upon signal for a positive find and extraction. Elias's head snapped up. Mr. Harlan, who had been sitting vigil on a crate nearby, rose slowly to his feet. "They found him, Elias," Mr. Harlan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Elias felt an immediate, overwhelming wave of dizzying relief. The burden, the heavy physical and emotional weight of the last few hours, lifted so swiftly it left him nauseous. A short while later, the sheriff's cruiser returned, followed by a large official ambulance, its lights flashing steadily, but its sirens silent, a sign of stabilized control. They pulled into the parking lot. Sheriff Dawson emerged, walking toward Elias and Mr. Harlan. He looked bone-weary, covered in the same grey dust that coated Elias, but his eyes held a profound, quiet relief. "Elias," the sheriff said, kneeling down again, meeting the boy's gaze directly. "The man is extracted, alive, critical condition but stable. He's heading to the regional trauma center now." Elias struggled to speak, finding his voice still weak. "The backpack, the strap. Was that him?" "Yes," the sheriff confirmed, his voice low. His right arm was pinned, trapped tightly by the strap of the bag that was anchored beneath the wedge. That bag, he nodded toward the rucksack, didn't just hold his supplies. It was the one thing that kept him from sliding deeper into a crevice when the initial collapse happened. It caught him. The strap kept him tethered, just outside the main kill zone. The sheriff paused, pulling the crayon drawing from his pocket again, handling the delicate paper with surprising care. "We identified him, Elias. His name is Robert Vance. He's a foreman, worked the site for 5 years. His young daughter, who drew this, is waiting for him in the city. Robert is going to make it." He gently handed the drawing back to Elias. "When we finally cleared enough debris to reach him, he was conscious, though barely. He kept whispering one thing, over and over again, barely audible." "What did he say?" Elias whispered. The sheriff smiled faintly, a slow, tired expression of profound gratitude. He kept asking about his bag, not the tools, not the coffee, but if his bag was safe, because he knew the drawing was inside. We told him it was found, safe, by a young man who saved his life. Elias looked down at the drawing, the colors swimming slightly through the film of dust and tears that now blurred his vision. The picture of the man in the yellow hard hat, the My Hero script, felt profoundly real, profoundly earned. The relief was overwhelming, releasing the exhaustion that had been held captive by adrenaline and urgency. Elias finally leaned against the wooden post of the porch, the profound emotional trauma of the night settling upon him. He had faced the crushing silence of the earth. He had heard the sound of human vulnerability at its limit, and he had acted. The heavy green backpack still rested on the ground beside him, the silent monument to the rescue, now empty of its urgency, but full of the profound weight of connection, a father's love, a child's hope, and a young boy's vulnerability, leading to an act of immense life-altering courage. Elias closed his eyes, holding the drawing tight against his chest, finally allowing himself to rest in the fragile, hard-won quiet of the pre-dawn hours.